Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be checking out the new Insta360 GPS Action Remote. We're going to check it out in more detail. We're going to run some tests on it, and in particular we're going to compare it to this guy. This is the old version of the GPS Action Remote. So we're going to see if it's worth buying, and if you already own the original remote, we're going to see if it's worth upgrading to the new version. But first, this guy. So before we get started, the usual disclaimer. This video is not sponsored or paid for in any way. All of the products featured were purchased with my own money, and the opinions expressed are entirely my own. Check out the description where you will find the chapters of this video, so if you want to skip straight to a specific section, you can do that. I've also placed product links to the products featured throughout this video, as well as some of the equipment that's used to create this video. So the original GPS remote was released about 3 years ago. In addition to being a remote control, it offers the ability to capture and embed GPS data directly into your video files, and then allows you to display different statistics as part of your footage. 3 years on, we now have the new GPS Action Remote. So let's check it out and see how it compares. So let's start out with the design. So the old remote was a long, narrow form factor with 2 buttons placed on the front of the remote. The new remote takes on more of a square form factor. It now has 3 buttons in total. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But all except the record button have now been moved to the side of the remote. And together with the new form factor, that allows, first of all, for a much larger screen. So we're now 1¼ inch diagonal versus 1 inch on the old one. Doesn't sound like a lot, but as you can see, it really does make a difference in terms of being able to see the status of your camera. The other advantage is it improves the distinction between the record button and any other functions on the remote. So you can imagine if you're operating the remote blind, if you're wearing gloves, if you're traveling on a bike or something else, you can imagine it's much easier to just reach and press the single button and start and stop recording than it is to worry about which button you're actually pressing. Now, both remotes have a ruggedized, water-resistant design. The new remote talks about its new IPX8 waterproof capability, allowing it to be submerged up to 5 meters. But if you look on the Insta360 website, it also says that you should not take this remote underwater. And frankly, I'm not sure your GPS capability or your Bluetooth capability would really work underwater anyway. Now, having said that, I have also personally taken the old remote underwater, not on purpose, but I did jump in a pool one time with this attached to my selfie stick, and it survived without any problems. So I wouldn't really have any problems taking either of these out in wet conditions. Both remotes have a rubber cover on the charging port. Now in the case of the old remote, you have micro USB, and one of the things I was definitely hoping for with the new remote is they would update that to USB-C, and lo and behold, there it is. So that's one very nice touch, is having USB-C capability on the new remote. As far as attaching the remote is concerned, the old style remote had this clip that was included that would allow you to place it on a selfie stick. And in addition, it would also provide this sort of rubberized wetsuit for your remote with a Velcro strap that would allow you to strap it to a wrist or similar. The new remote has this little turntable, as they call it, on the back here that allows you to attach one of these 2 rubberized straps. They're very similar to the Apple sports straps that you find on an Apple Watch. The shorter one is designed for hooking it on to a selfie stick. It also does work with the extended selfie stick. That's the 3 meter selfie stick, but only just, as you can see. and the larger strap is intended for using as a wrist strap. Once this is strapped in place, you can also turn it to either horizontal or vertical orientation, depending on your preference. So let's talk about operating. Now, for the purpose of this test, I have the old remote paired to my X2, and I have the new remote paired to my X3. But I've operated them the other way around with the new remote on the X2 and the old remote on the X2, and I can assure you that the results are exactly the same. So the old style remote had just these two buttons. We have the record button, and then we have the power/mode button. The new remote now has three buttons, so it has separated the power button from the mode button, and then you still have the standard record button here. Now on the product page for the new GPS remote, Insta360 talks about the Remote Wake Anytime feature, and they talk about it like it's something new. But in fact, this feature has been available on the X2 with the old remote for several years already. As long as you have the Bluetooth wake function enabled on your X2 or X3, when you power up the remote, it also powers up the camera. Now on the new remote, this works a little bit differently. So as we said before, we now have a separate power button on the side of the remote. So when I first hold it down, it powers on just the remote. If I want to turn on the camera, I simply press the power button again and it powers up the camera. Now I'm not quite sure why there's a need for a separate power on cycle for the camera versus the remote, but perhaps there are use cases that I'm not considering here. And when it comes to powering off, holding down the power button first turns off the camera. If you release, it will actually leave the remote powered. And holding down again turns off the remote. Or you can just hold the remote for 6 seconds and it will power off both. There's a couple of things to note about the remote wake up function. The first being the amount of time it takes for the camera to actually be controllable from the remote. Now this might sound a little strange because we're waking it up with Bluetooth, but here's what I mean. So when I power on the camera, and I'm going to start the clock here, you'll see that the camera powers up, but at this point I'm not able to actually do anything with the camera. None of the buttons will actually perform any functions until it's fully connected to the camera. And on the X3, this takes around 25 to 26 seconds. Now this has nothing to do with the remote itself. This has more to do with the X3 in this case. The X2, in fact, is able to connect within about 13 seconds. And again, this is nothing to do with the remote because you get the same result whether you're using the old remote or the new remote. So repeating the experiment now using the X2 with the old remote, if I start the clock, now, you'll notice that the X2 connects much faster than the X3. And again, this has nothing to do with the old remote or the new remote. You get the same result regardless of which remote you use. The other thing to note about the remote wake feature is if the battery were to die, or if you remove the battery, either to exchange it or to get out the SD card, once you reinsert the battery, your remote wake up feature no longer works. In order to make it work, you have to power on the camera manually and wait for the remote to reconnect. Now that the camera has reconnected with the remote, the camera can of course be powered off with the remote, and remote wake up works again. So let's look at operating the camera using the remote. Now, as we mentioned with the old remote, there were just two buttons, the record button and the mode button. We use the mode button, of course, to power up and power off the camera. Once it's powered on, the mode button now acts as, of course, a means of selecting the mode. So I can toggle through the different recording modes on the camera each time I press the mode button. When the camera goes into a sleep mode, the mode button is used to wake it up. Now, one thing to mention regarding the old remote is there was always a little bit of a lag in response between pressing the mode button and something happening on the camera, as you can see. If I try to quickly go through the modes, it always lags a little bit behind, and sometimes you end up with the wrong mode selected. With the new remote, this has definitely been improved regarding the responsiveness. Now, one thing you'll notice with the mode button on the new remote is that it only allows you 4 different shooting modes: video, time shift, loop recording, and photo. It skips over the other modes. Now, you can select any mode you want, and it will be shown here also on the remote display, but you can only select between those 4 modes using the remote. Now, one very nice feature of the new remote was this nice indicator light that you can see at the top here. If I were to start recording, you'll notice that the indicator light flashes red, clearly showing to me that the camera is recording. Now, this is particularly useful if you don't necessarily have the camera in your line of sight. With the old remote, you have to look very closely to see the timer counting here to show that it's recording. Okay, let's do a remote control range test. So I have the old remote hooked up to my X2 here, and what I'm going to do is simply change the mode. I have my new remote connected to the X3, and similarly we're just going to change the mode. Now, the claimed range on the old remote is 33 feet. The claimed range on the new remote is 66 feet. So I've placed markers at 30 feet, 60 feet, and just for fun at 80 feet. So I'm going to head out and see if we can still control these at that distance. So let's go to 30 feet. Okay, here we are at 30 feet testing the old remote. And testing the new remote. And now at 60 feet, old remote. And new remote. And now at 80 feet, which is well beyond the stated range of both remotes, old remote. And the new remote. Okay, so one of the improvements to the new generation remote is its GPS performance in terms of connectivity and stability of the signal. So we're going to run a couple of tests. First off, we're going to see how quickly each of the remotes acquires a GPS signal. We're going to power them up and see how long it takes. So let's start with the old remote. And now let's do the same test on the new remote. Okay, let's go for a drive, capture some GPS data and embed it in our video to see how the two units perform. This time we're going to start out with the new remote. It's up here with a good view to the sky, so we maintain our GPS signal, and let's see how it works. So what is the verdict on the Insta360 GPS Action Remote? So first off, let's just take it on its own merit without considering the old version. From my perspective, I would say this is an essential piece of kit. Now, of course, you can operate your camera through your smartphone. You can also use voice commands to start and stop recording, but there are all kinds of situations where those are not going to be practical solutions and you really need something more like this. Added to that, you also have the GPS statistics, which you can embed in your video, and that's a really cool bonus to have with this remote. Now, if we compare it to the old remote, things are not quite as clear. Now, when you consider there is almost 3 years between the release date of the old remote and the new remote, I gotta say I'm a little disappointed that they haven't improved more. But let's take a look at what those improvements are. Well, first off, of course, you have the larger screen. That's definitely one of the biggest bonuses for me. It makes it much easier to operate and see exactly what you're doing on the screen. And added to that, the status light also adds to the ease of operation. I do like that they've improved the responsiveness, so when you hit the button, it immediately responds on the camera. But remember, the range is certainly not better on the new remote, and you also have to deal with that strange mode changing where you only select between 4 modes. As far as GPS performance is concerned, Insta360 says that the new remote has better connectivity and stability, although I really wasn't able to confirm that during my testing. But I will say that in general, on startup, the new remote did acquire the signal faster and with more bars. Also, the mounting options, I do like the new turntable and the combination with the straps. I think that gives it a little bit more versatility of mounting than the old remote. And finally, just a small thing, I do appreciate now that it has a USB-C charging port instead of the old micro USB, but also just be warned that the battery on the new remote is almost half the size of the older remote. Now, not that I ever had a problem with battery life on the old remote, but just worth mentioning. So I really think it just comes down to personal preference as to whether those features will justify the upgrade from the old version to the new version. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to put those into the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting the like button and also consider subscribing to our channel, where there will be a lot more content around Insta360 and technology in general. Thank you again for watching.